300 Spartans versus Persia, holding back an entire army. History often hinges on quiet places, a narrow pass between mountains and sea, a winding road no wider than a few horse carts, a point on the map that for most of time seemed insignificant until the fate of the world passed through it. Thermopylae was that place, and in 400 BC it became the fault line between two civilizations, the mighty Persian Empire, stretching from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea, and the fiercely independent city-states of ancient Greece. The man leading the charge from the east was Xerxes I, king of kings, son of Darius the Great. After the humiliating Persian defeat at Marathon a decade earlier, Xerxes was determined to crush Greece once and for all, not just to avenge his father's loss, but to expand Persia's glory to the very edge of the known world. With him came a force unlike anything Greece had ever seen. Historians estimate the army numbered in the hundreds of thousands. It was, by all measures, the greatest military machine on earth. To the fragmented Greek city-states, this was nothing short of apocalypse. Many submitted without resistance. Others wavered. Yet a handful, led by Athens and Sparta, chose to resist. It was a perilous gamble. Greece, unlike Persia, had no unified command, no emperor, no singular vision. It was a loose network of independent polis, each proud, often quarrelsome, and fiercely territorial. But what Greece lacked in unity, it made up for in principle. For them, the Persian invasion was not just a military threat. It was a war of values. East against West, tyranny against freedom, submission against citizenship. At stake was not merely land, but the soul of a civilization. Enter Leonidas, king of Sparta, a man raised in one of the most brutal military systems the world has ever known. Spartan boys were taken from their families at age 7, hardened in the agoge, forged into hoplites through discipline, pain, and pride. Leonidas was no stranger to sacrifice, but when he volunteered to lead a small contingent to hold Thermopylae against the Persian juggernaut, he wasn't just choosing a difficult mission. He was walking into legend. He took with him 300 Spartans, each with a living son to ensure their bloodline would not perish. This was not a suicide mission, but a symbolic one. The 300 were accompanied by several thousand allies from other Greek city-states, Thespians, Thebans, and more. But it was the Spartans who would become immortalized, for they were not marching to win. They were marching to buy time. Thermopylae, literally the hot gates, was the perfect place to make a stand. A narrow pass hemmed in by cliffs and sea, it neutralized the Persian numerical advantage. Their cavalry would be useless here, their archers restricted, their sheer numbers turned into a liability. If Greece had a chance to hold, this was it, and so they dug in, shields raised, spears at the ready, knowing full well that they were outnumbered, outflanked, and most likely doomed. But they also knew this: if they could delay the Persian army for even a few days, it might be enough for the rest of Greece to rally. Enough time for Athens to finish evacuating its citizens. Enough time for the allied city-states to organize a true defense. Enough time for history to shift. As the Persian vanguard approached, carrying banners of empire and conquest, the Spartans sharpened their spears in silence. There were no songs, no speeches, just the low murmur of bronze on stone, and the knowledge that what they did here might echo through centuries, and so began one of the most famous last stands in the history of the world. The first day at Thermopylae dawned with a quiet tension. Mist curled over the sea. The narrow pass lay still, deceptively calm. On one side, the Spartan-led coalition stood in disciplined ranks, shields locked shoulder to shoulder. On the other, far beyond the field of view, the Persian army stretched beyond the horizon, an ocean of men, horses, chariots, and steel. It was a confrontation of unimaginable scale against immovable resolve. Xerxes, confident in his supremacy, sent an emissary ahead. He offered the Greeks a chance to surrender, promising them safety, positions of favor, even riches. But Leonidas answered not with negotiation, but with defiance. According to legend, when asked to lay down their weapons, the Spartan king responded with 2 words, "Molon labe," "Come and take them." It was not arrogance. It was clarity. For the Spartans, honor was not symbolic. It was sacred. To retreat would be to betray every law, every ancestor, every principle on which their city was founded. For them, there was no victory without sacrifice, and no defeat if they died standing. The battle began with waves of Persian infantry, perhaps expecting a quick rout of this small force. But what met them at the mouth of Thermopylae was not a mob. It was a wall. The Greek phalanx formation was one of the most efficient instruments of war in the ancient world. Rows of hoplites, each armed with a large round shield and a long spear, overlapping and supporting one another like a living engine of defense. The Spartans, standing at the center of the Greek line, were trained not just to fight, but to endure. They used the terrain to their advantage, forcing the Persians into a narrow funnel where only a limited number could engage at once. There was no room for cavalry, no space for fancy maneuvers. It was a grinding, brutal test of stamina and cohesion. Hour after hour, wave after wave, the Persians attacked and were repelled. Their armor was lighter, their tactics ill-suited for the pass. They were not prepared for men who did not flinch, did not break formation, who pushed forward with methodical rhythm, even as bodies piled at their feet. Xerxes watched from afar, expecting his elite units, the famed immortals, to tip the scales. Clad in ornate robes and skilled in combat, they were his personal guard, the pride of Persia. But even the immortals, once thrown into the grinder of the Greek line, found themselves bloodied and stunned. They gained no ground. They faced warriors who would rather die than step backward. And yet, despite the heroics, the Greeks knew their situation was not sustainable. They were running low on food, water, and supplies. Reinforcements would not come. Their allies from other cities fought bravely, but none had the grim resolve of Sparta, forged through a lifetime of preparing to die well. Still, on that first day, and again on the second, they held. They did more than hold. They humiliated the Persians. What was meant to be a march of domination had become a stalemate. Xerxes grew restless. He watched as his grand army faltered against a mere trickle of resistance. This wasn't just a military setback, it was a spiritual wound to the imperial pride. But the king would not wait forever. And unfortunately for the Greeks, treachery would soon tip the balance. A man named Ephialtes, a local Greek familiar with the terrain, approached the Persian camp. Whether driven by greed or fear, he revealed a hidden mountain path that bypassed the narrow pass. A route that would allow the Persians to encircle the Greek defenders. It was the dagger in the back Leonidas had always feared. The Spartans had chosen Thermopylae not because they thought it was impenetrable, but because its vulnerabilities were manageable, so long as secrecy and terrain held. Now, with that secrecy broken, time was no longer their ally. Word of the betrayal reached the Greek camp under cover of night. Most of the allied contingents were dismissed. Leonidas knew they would be slaughtered if they stayed. Only a few remained. The 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians who refused to leave, and a handful of others. They were not going to win, but that had never been the point. By morning, they stood again at the pass, fewer in number, but undiminished in will. The tide was turning, but they would not move. They would face the full might of Persia one last time, not because they thought they could change the outcome of the battle, but because they believed it would change the course of history. The sun rose slowly over Thermopylae on the third day, casting a golden hue over the sea and cliffs. But for the men who stood beneath that light, there was no warmth, only the finality of what was to come. Leonidas and his remaining forces, 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, a few Thebans, stood at the mouth of the pass one last time. They had eaten their final rations, said their last words, sharpened their blades not for survival, but for remembrance. No reinforcements would come. No escape awaited. They had chosen to remain not because they expected to win, but because they refused to leave a battlefield where duty had called. In Sparta, there was no higher virtue than to die in defense of the city. But this went beyond Sparta. This was a stand for Greece, for resistance, for a message that would survive, even if they did not. By now, the Persian army had completed its flanking maneuver through the hidden path. The Greeks were surrounded. Xerxes, seizing the moment, ordered a full assault. No more probing attacks or tactical restraint. This was annihilation. And yet, what followed was not a slaughter, but a defiant blaze of resistance so fierce it shook even the Persian elite. The Spartans pushed forward with renewed fury. Every moment mattered now, not to delay the inevitable, but to define it. They fought with swords, with spears, with broken shields and bare hands. Hoplite formation gave way to a fluid and desperate melee. Still, they held together. Still, they killed. According to ancient accounts, the Spartans drove the enemy back multiple times that morning, even as their flanks collapsed and their numbers dwindled. Among the fallen Persians lay members of Xerxes' own royal guard, some reportedly trampled by their own men in the chaos. Xerxes, watching from a distant throne, grew frustrated, enraged, even afraid. This was no ordinary resistance. This was a reckoning. As the fight dragged on, the Greek lines shrank inward. Leonidas himself fought in the front, as was expected of a Spartan king. He was not a commander watching from behind. He was a warrior among his peers. At some point during the clash, Leonidas fell. The sources differ on how. Some say he was struck by an arrow, others by spear. But what matters is what happened after. The Spartans fought like men possessed to recover his body. They would not allow it to fall into enemy hands. This, too, was part of the code. A Spartan king did not die in obscurity. He died surrounded by the men who swore to follow him to the end. And follow they did. When the Persian pressure became overwhelming, the Greeks retreated to a nearby hill, a last defensible position. There, they formed a circle, battered, bloodied, but unyielding. It was here that the Persians unleashed their final tactic: archers. From afar, they rained down arrows upon the defenders. There was no room to move, no cover to seek. The ancient historian Herodotus wrote that the arrows were so numerous they blotted out the sun. And yet, the Spartans stood. One warrior is said to have joked, "Good, then we shall fight in the shade." Eventually, they fell, every last one of them. The Persians claimed the battlefield, but not without cost, and certainly not with honor. In a final act of humiliation, Xerxes ordered Leonidas's body decapitated and crucified, a message to all who would defy him. But if the king sought to bury the Greek spirit with that act, he failed. What he had unknowingly done was turn a battlefield into a shrine, and a fallen king into a martyr. In death, the 300 Spartans and their companions achieved what no living force in Greece could have done. They unified a fractured land. Their sacrifice ignited something far greater than fear. It sparked resolve. Word of the last stand spread across the city-states. Farmers, craftsmen, scholars, citizens from every corner of Greece began to see themselves not as isolated peoples, but as one civilization facing an existential threat. Thermopylae had done what no diplomat or treaty ever could. It had given Greece a reason to stand together. When the final body collapsed on the hill at Thermopylae, the fighting ceased, but the war had only just begun. The Persian dead littered the pass, thousands of them. But Xerxes, despite his losses, now held the gates to mainland Greece. With Thermopylae broken, the road to central Greece lay open. There was no longer any military force between his army and the heart of the Greek world. And so, the king marched on. The fall of Thermopylae was not just a tactical shift, it was a psychological rupture. Across the Greek city-states, panic set in. Many who had hesitated to join the resistance now surrendered or fled. Others, like the Boeotians and Thessalians, switched sides entirely, hoping to escape the fate they feared would come. The most immediate and devastating consequence was the evacuation of Athens. The city knew it could not hold. With the Persian land army advancing and their vast navy circling the coast, Athens would be surrounded, suffocated, and destroyed unless drastic action was taken. And so the Athenians did the unthinkable. They abandoned their city. Under the leadership of Themistocles, the population was evacuated by sea to the nearby island of Salamis and other safer territories. Women, children, and the elderly were ferried away by trireme, leaving behind empty streets and shuttered temples. It was a heartbreaking sight. Families wept on the docks. Priests carried sacred flames across the water. Entire generations of Athenian memory were left behind to face destruction. Soon after, the Persian army entered Athens. They razed it. Temples were looted, statues toppled, the Acropolis set aflame. Xerxes ordered the city burned as a message to the rest of Greece. This is the price of defiance. The ruins of Athens smoldered under the Aegean sun, casting columns of smoke that could be seen for miles. Xerxes, seated atop a makeshift throne, watched as the city was reduced to ash. He believed the war was won. But what Xerxes failed to understand was what Thermopylae had truly accomplished. Leonidas and his 300 Spartans had not stopped the Persian army, but they had bought time. Time for Athens to evacuate, time for the Greek navy to assemble, time for the city-states to finally realize that this was not a local war. It was civilizational. What Thermopylae ignited was something more powerful than stone walls or hoplite formations: unity. It did what centuries of diplomacy and alliances had failed to do. For once, Greek quarrels were set aside. Former rivals came together. Sparta and Athens, so different in governance, culture, and worldview, stood on the same side of the phalanx. As refugees flooded into Salamis and other island shelters, leaders gathered to strategize. Themistocles, the cunning Athenian admiral, saw an opportunity. While Xerxes had overwhelmed on land, his vast navy was vulnerable in the tight, narrow straits. If the Greeks could lure the Persian fleet into a confined battle, they might level the playing field. But not all were convinced. After all, Greece had just suffered a crushing defeat. Many commanders wanted to retreat further, protect the Peloponnesus, build a wall across the Isthmus of Corinth, and let central Greece fall. They had seen what happened to Athens and feared total annihilation. But Themistocles insisted. Now was the time to strike. He reminded them of Thermopylae, not just the sacrifice, but the message. If they fled again, the death of Leonidas and his warriors would be for nothing. If they stood and fought, they could not only avenge Athens, they could send a message back to Persia, more powerful than any wall or defense ever could. The debate was heated, tensions ran high. But in the end, the alliance agreed. They would fight, not on land, but at sea. Not to delay, but to decide. And thus, from the ashes of Athens and the blood of Thermopylae, the stage was set for one of the greatest naval engagements in ancient history, the Battle of Salamis. In the weeks following Thermopylae, while the ruins of Athens still smoldered under Persian boots, the war entered a new phase. The Greeks, once fractured and scrambling, had found their center, not in a palace or a politician, but in a pass. Thermopylae had become a rallying cry, a proof that courage could hold back conquest. Now, vengeance was within reach. Themistocles, the brilliant and often controversial Athenian admiral, understood something few others did. Naval superiority could decide the war. While Xerxes' land army seemed unstoppable, his navy, vast as it was vulnerable in tight quarters. The Persian fleet was made up of contingents from Egypt, Phoenicia, and Ionia, each with their own strengths, but also their own weaknesses in coordination and command. By contrast, the Greek fleet, though smaller, was united in desperation. Drawn from Athens, Corinth, Aegina, and a dozen other polis, these sailors knew the stakes. Many had watched their homes burn. Many had ferried their own families to safety. Their oars pulled not for gold or glory, but to ensure there was still a Greece to return to. Themistocles had his eyes set on a narrow stretch of sea between the island of Salamis and the Greek mainland. There, the broad and cumbersome Persian fleet would be forced to compress, creating chaos, exactly what the Greeks needed. But not everyone agreed. Some Spartan and Peloponnesian leaders wanted to retreat further south, defending only the Peloponnese and leaving central Greece to its fate. They argued Salamis was too exposed, that a defeat there would doom them all. But Themistocles had learned from Leonidas. He understood the power of timing, of symbolism, of making a stand where it mattered, not just strategically, but spiritually. To retreat now would render Thermopylae meaningless. To fight here was to validate that sacrifice. And so, with political pressure rising, Themistocles employed a trick. According to Herodotus, he sent a secret message to Xerxes through a supposed defector, claiming that the Greek fleet was in disarray and planning to escape. If the Persian navy acted fast, they could trap and destroy the Greeks before they fled. Xerxes took the bait. The massive Persian fleet entered the straits of Salamis in waves, their numbers turning from advantage to liability. As ships crowded into the narrow channel, they lost room to maneuver. Oars collided. Commanders shouted conflicting orders. It was, as Themistocles predicted, a floating disaster. Then came the Greeks. Like arrows fired into a collapsing structure, the Greek triremes darted in tight formation. Their smaller, more agile hulls smashed into Persian ships with bronze-tipped rams. Boarders leapt across decks, swords flashing. Athenian sailors fought like men possessed. Corinthian ships flanked the edges, driving enemy vessels onto rocks. The once proud Persian fleet descended into panic. Xerxes watched from a golden throne built on a hill overlooking the battle, expecting to see a final triumph. Instead, he witnessed catastrophe. Ships burned, bodies floated in the water. Captains drowned, tangled in sails. His admiral, Ariobaegnus, brother to Xerxes, was killed in the melee. Persian morale shattered. By day's end, the Persians had lost at least 200 ships. Some sources claim more. The Greeks, though battered, had held. They had done more than hold. They had broken the Persian navy. Xerxes, stunned, realized the war had changed. Without naval dominance, supplying his land army became far more dangerous. His lines were stretched, his logistics precarious. Fearful of being trapped in hostile territory, he made a fateful decision. He would withdraw the majority of his forces and return to Persia. He left behind a smaller army under the command of General Mardonius to continue the campaign. For the Greeks, it was nothing short of a resurrection. Just weeks before, they had stood on the edge of annihilation. Their cities burned, their armies scattered, their morale broken. But now, with one naval victory, they had turned the tide. Thermopylae had been the funeral pyre, but Salamis was the spark that lit the way forward. The message was clear. Persia could be beaten. And it all traced back to that narrow mountain pass where 300 Spartans bought the time Greece so desperately needed. The world had watched them die. Now it would watch Greece rise. In the wake of Salamis, the tide of war had turned, but the current was still treacherous. Xerxes may have retreated with the bulk of his army, but he left behind a formidable force under his trusted general, Mardonius. Perhaps more pragmatic than his king, Mardonius saw an opportunity. Without Xerxes's grand ambitions clouding his judgment, he would try a different approach. Not brute force, but diplomacy, bribes, and selective terror. He offered Athens a deal. Submit, and they would be spared. Align with Persia, and they would be rewarded with autonomy and wealth. But Athens, still licking its wounds from the burning of the Acropolis, refused. The memory of Thermopylae still burned too bright. The sacrifice had not been in vain, and to accept peace now would render it so. Once again, Athens was evacuated. Once again, it was razed. The Persians reoccupied the smoking ruins. But this time, they faced a different Greece. No longer fractured, no longer timid, the Greek city-states were beginning to move in unison. Sparta, despite its caution and reluctance to engage far from its own borders, finally understood the larger game. They could no longer wait behind mountain passes. They had to meet the Persians head-on. In early 479 BC, a massive Greek coalition army gathered, by some estimates, nearly 40,000 strong. Hoplites from Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Plataea, and dozens of other cities marched north to confront Mardonius in Boeotia. At their center stood a Spartan commander named Pausanias, nephew of Leonidas. The symbolism was clear. Thermopylae was not forgotten, it was about to be avenged. The Persian force still outnumbered the Greeks, but numbers were no longer destiny. At Plataea, the terrain was open, not confined like Thermopylae, but the lessons learned from that narrow pass echoed in every formation, every order, every defiant cheer. The early stages of the battle were marked by strategic stalemates. Neither side wanted to commit too early. Mardonius attempted to repeat the tactics of Xerxes, dividing Greek loyalties, tempting cities with promises. But he found less fertile ground. The sacrifice of the 300 had become more than legend. It was a moral compass. Even cities that once wavered, that once submitted, now sent troops. When fighting finally erupted, it was fierce and chaotic. The Persians initially gained some ground, exploiting Greek supply lines and pressing hard on weaker flanks. But they could not crack the Spartan core. Led by Pausanias, the Spartans stood with the same steel discipline that had made their ancestors immortal at Thermopylae. Shield to shield, they pushed back the elite Persian cavalry, outlasted the archers, and then drove straight through the center of Mardonius's force. At the height of the chaos, Mardonius himself was killed, struck down by a Spartan warrior hurling a stone, according to some accounts. His death shattered Persian morale. What followed was a rout. Thousands of Persians were cut down in retreat. Their camp was stormed, their treasures seized, their dreams of domination buried in the soil of Boeotia. That same day, as if choreographed by fate, the Greek navy won another victory at Mycale, off the Ionian coast. The twin triumphs of Plataea and Mycale broke Persian ambitions in Greece once and for all. The great invasion that had begun with such thunder, crossing the Hellespont on floating bridges, towering banners waving over conquered lands, ended in silence and defeat. But what lingered was not just military victory, it was legacy. Leonidas had fallen nearly a year before, on that nameless hill at Thermopylae. But his stand had never truly ended. It lived on in every spear lifted at Plataea, in every hoplite who refused to yield, in every citizen who, when given the chance to surrender, chose to fight instead. The Spartans recovered Leonidas' body after the war. According to tradition, his remains were returned to Sparta, where he was buried with honor. A monument was raised, and an annual festival established in his name. But the greater monument was Greece itself, still free, still standing. Plataea was the final nail in the Persian campaign. But it was Thermopylae that gave Greece the resolve to hammer it in. Thermopylae did not end with the clash of spears or the fall of Leonidas. Long after the dead were buried and the dust settled, the story lived on, retold, reshaped, and revered. It grew not just into history, but into something deeper, myth. Not myth in the sense of fantasy, but in the ancient sense of memory elevated, etched into the soul of a people. During the medieval period, as Europe fractured under feudalism, and Rome's legacy was scattered among rival kingdoms, Thermopylae lived on in monasteries and manuscripts. The epic of the 300, though less prominent in public discourse, survived in Latin chronicles and Byzantine lore. In the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, the tale became both a historical memory and a political metaphor, especially as the Byzantines faced their own long decline under external threat. But it was not until the Renaissance and Enlightenment that Thermopylae was fully resurrected. As Western Europe rediscovered the classical world through archaeology, philosophy, and science, stories like that of Leonidas returned with new vitality. Renaissance thinkers held up Sparta, not always accurately, as an exemplar of civic virtue. To their minds, Thermopylae was not just a military moment, but a philosophical one. The individual giving everything for the collective good. In the 18th century, as revolutions swept across Europe and the Americas, Thermopylae was reborn again. This time in pamphlets and declarations. French revolutionaries drew parallels between the 300 Spartans and their own struggle against monarchy. American revolutionaries spoke of standing firm like the Greeks against Imperial Britain. The story was no longer Greek. It was universal. Even the enemies of liberty couldn't resist the symbolism. Napoleon Bonaparte, a man both celebrated and feared for his use of historical imagery, referenced the Spartans in speeches to his troops. Thermopylae became shorthand for heroism under fire, regardless of the cause. This ambiguity would follow the tale into the modern world, used both by liberators and by regimes seeking to glorify sacrifice in service of control. In Greece itself, Thermopylae remained a foundational myth. During the 19th century War of Independence against the Ottoman Empire, rebel leaders explicitly invoked Leonidas and the 300 as models of resistance. Songs were written, poems recited. Greek fighters at Missolonghi and other sieges claimed the mantle of the Spartans, not because they expected to survive, but because they wanted to be remembered as those who chose principle over survival. In the 20th century, the myth reached a global audience through mass media. Films like The 300 Spartans, 1962, and 300, 2006, dramatized the battle for new generations. While historically embellished, stylized with slow-motion combat and fantasy-like villainy, the heart of the story remained, that of a few warriors holding the line against impossible odds. Thermopylae entered classrooms, war colleges, and even political campaigns. During World War II, British and Greek soldiers fighting Axis powers once again evoked the past. Winston Churchill himself referenced the Spartans in a speech rallying resistance. In Cold War rhetoric, the battle was reframed as freedom versus authoritarianism, democracy versus domination. But with each retelling, the story became both more powerful and more complicated. Who, in the modern world, has the right to claim Thermopylae? Can an ancient military aristocracy be held up as democratic champions? Can a society that valued obedience and hierarchy be a symbol for liberty? Perhaps that's the strength of Thermopylae, not in its moral clarity, but in its adaptability. Each era finds something different in its dust. One generation sees military valor, another sees civic duty. Some find tragedy, others triumph. And still, the past remains. Even now, a traveler can walk the narrow road between mountain and sea. The geography has changed, sediment and centuries have widened the land, but the spirit lingers. There stands a modern monument to Leonidas, flanked by a bronze relief of the battle, and beside it, carved into stone, still reads the ancient epitaph. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. It is not just a message to Sparta, it is a message to us all. In the modern age, the Battle of Thermopylae continues to captivate, but fascination has evolved into introspection. As historians peel back the layers of legend, they invite us to consider not only what happened, but what we want Thermopylae to mean. At face value, the battle is often presented as a clash between freedom and tyranny, east and west, few against many. And while these themes have dramatic appeal, they are not so easily mapped onto the complex realities of 5th century BC geopolitics. Persia, for instance, was not the cartoonish evil empire depicted in modern popular culture. It was, in many respects, a sophisticated, multi-ethnic state, tolerant of local religions, advanced in administration, and often more culturally pluralistic than its Greek counterparts. The notion of Persia as a faceless, authoritarian behemoth reflects more about the West's own anxieties than ancient truth. Likewise, Sparta was not a beacon of modern liberty. It was a rigidly hierarchical society, built on militarism and slavery. Its famous discipline came at the cost of individuality and human rights. The Spartans, for all their bravery, ruled over a vast population of helots, enslaved people who toiled in fields and served the city-state under brutal conditions. So what does it mean to revere 300 Spartans? Are we celebrating valor or glorifying a deeply flawed society? These are not questions with easy answers, but they are necessary ones. Modern historians such as Paul Cartledge and Tom Holland have argued that Thermopylae must be understood in context, not as a universal metaphor, but as a specific moment within a specific world. The Greeks were not democratic in the modern sense, and their values were not always ours. And yet, the essence of Thermopylae endures not because it aligns neatly with modern ideals, but because it challenges us to wrestle with courage in uncomfortable forms. We admire Leonidas not because he was perfect, but because he stood when surrender was easier. We remember the 300 not because they represented modern democracy, but because they embodied an idea that some causes are worth dying for, even if they are not ours. That nuance is more important than ever in an era of political polarization and historical revision. Thermopylae, like many great events of the past, can be twisted into propaganda. Extremist groups have occasionally co-opted Spartan imagery to glorify violence or exclusion. Films have stylized the battle as a grand morality play, stripping it of complexity in favor of spectacle. And yet, despite all that, the deeper message still slips through: the power of sacrifice, the cost of principle, and the enduring relevance of moral courage. In academic circles, Thermopylae is now often studied not only for its tactical implications, but as a case study in cultural memory. How do nations choose their heroes? What gets preserved in stone, and what is left in the dust? How does myth shape identity? In Greece today, these questions are alive. The battle remains part of school curriculums. National pride pulses through every retelling. Yet modern Greeks, like modern historians, also wrestle with the duality of their ancestors: brave yet brutal, noble yet narrow. Thermopylae invites not blind reverence, but honest inquiry. It forces us to sit with contradictions, to appreciate the valor without romanticizing the violence, to admire the discipline without embracing the dogma. Perhaps that is the greatest gift the battle has left us, not just a tale of courage, but a mirror. Because in the end, Thermopylae is not about 300 Spartans alone. It's about anyone who chooses to stand when the world says kneel, anyone who sacrifices for others, even when no one is watching, anyone who believes that the future deserves more than passive survival. It deserves commitment, even in the face of defeat. We do not need to idealize the Spartans to draw strength from their stand. We only need to recognize that human beings, even with all their flaws, are capable of greatness when they choose to be. And that choice, now as then, is what history remembers. Thermopylae is more than a name on a map or a chapter in a history book. It is a crossroads where time folds and questions born in fire still echo into the present. It is a place where the sea once ran red, and where silence today carries the weight of shouts, clashes, final breaths. It is both battlefield and metaphor, a physical location and a moral landscape. The men who died there did not know they would become immortal. They could not have predicted that centuries later, their names, Leonidas, Dianic, Alpheus, would be etched into stone and song. That the world would remember them not for victory, but for resistance, not for conquest, but for conviction. And yet, here we are, still speaking their names. There's something in that narrow pass that still compels us. Something about the image of a few standing against a tide. In an age flooded with cynicism and pragmatism, the idea of doing something simply because it is right, not winnable, still holds power. That's what Thermopylae gives us. Not just history, but a framework. It asks, what will you stand for when you know you might lose? What is worth enduring hardship for? When the moment comes, and it always comes, will you choose the path of comfort or the one of consequence? Thermopylae doesn't answer those questions. It doesn't preach. It simply shows us a moment, a choice, a stand, and lets us decide what to do with it. In a modern world defined by scale, megacities, mass armies, billions of digital voices, the story of 300 men still resonates. Not because we believe we must be warriors, but because we want to believe that individual courage still matters, that values outlast empires, that resistance, even when doomed, is never wasted if done with purpose. At Thermopylae today, the Earth has shifted. The coastline has moved. The pass is no longer so narrow. But stand there long enough, and you can still feel it, the presence of something vast and quiet. A history written not in triumph, but in tenacity. There are larger battles, more decisive victories, but few moments when so little stood against so much, and left behind so profound a legacy. Leonidas fell. His men were buried. Persia marched on. But Greece did not forget, and neither did the world. Because every time a people refuse to surrender their voice, every time a lone figure chooses honor over advantage, every time we ask ourselves, what do we stand for? We pass through Thermopylae once more. That brings us to the end of today's video. What do you think about the story of Thermopylae? We'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and share it with fellow history lovers. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into the past. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.